The doctor didn't look at her son. He looked at her hands, her worn coat, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, and he decided who she was before she ever opened her mouth. That was his first mistake. "It's his lifestyle, Miss Adebayo," he said, the words sliding off his tongue with a practiced, sterile smoothness. "Diet, air quality in the home, genetics." Lena Adebayo felt the air leave her own lungs. She sat on the cold vinyl chair in the small, beige examination room, her 8-year-old son, Samuel, breathing in wheezing, shallow gasps beside her. His small hand held his inhaler like a religious artifact, a blue plastic god he prayed to for his next breath. Samuel had drawn a picture while they waited, a family of stick figures under a sky the color of rust and old bruises. He told her it was the view from his window. Lena's purse strap dug into her shoulder. She had come here for answers, for help, for a doctor to see the terror in her son's constricted chest and fight with her. Instead, she got a verdict. It was her fault, her home, her food, her blood. The doctor, a man named Alistair Finch with a starched white coat and eyes that held no warmth, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses. He tapped a perfectly manicured finger on Samuel's chart. "These environmental theories are often anecdotal. We must focus on what we can control. More fruits, more vegetables. Perhaps an air purifier for his bedroom. Has he been keeping up with his medication?" Lena didn't answer. She was looking at her son, at the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. He was trying so hard to be brave, to breathe without showing the panic that lived inside his ribs. The doctor's voice was a drone, a meaningless hum of dismissal. He saw a poor black woman from the east side, the part of the city cradled by the smokestacks of the Viridian chemical plant. He saw a liability, not a life. She stood up, her movements stiff. She helped Samuel off the examination table, his small body leaning against hers. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything at all. As she walked out, leaving Dr. Finch to his charts and his clean, controlled world, a promise took root in her heart, hard and sharp as a shard of glass. He hadn't listened to her words, but one day he would have no choice but to hear her truth. Their apartment was on the 4th floor of a brick building that had seen better decades. From their small balcony, the Viridian plant was a permanent fixture on the horizon, a metal beast with a dozen mouths that exhaled plumes of gray, yellow, and sometimes, in the dead of night, a strange, shimmering orange. The smell was a constant companion, a metallic, chemical tang that clung to the curtains and settled like a fine dust on the windowsills. Lena had tried to grow things out there. A small pot of mint, a stubborn tomato vine, but the leaves always yellowed and curled in on themselves, as if recoiling from the very air they were meant to breathe. The plants, like her son, were struggling for life. Samuel spent most of his time indoors now, near the window, his sketchbook open on his lap. He drew what he saw: skies that were never blue, suns that were hazy, distant smudges, chimneys that breathed dragons of smoke. He was a quiet archivist of his own suffocating world. One evening, after a particularly bad night that ended in a 2 a.m. trip to the emergency room, Lena sat by his bed, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, a fragile miracle orchestrated by steroids and albuterol. The bills from these visits were piling up in a shoebox under her bed, a collection of white envelopes that felt like threats. She picked up his sketchbook from the floor. Page after page, the story was the same. A world painted in shades of sickness. She stopped at one drawing. It showed their building, and floating down from the sky were not raindrops or snowflakes, but tiny, gray specks. Samuel had labeled them the dust that makes me cough. That was it. That was the moment the quiet fear in her heart hardened into resolve. Her son wasn't just sick. He was being poisoned, and his drawings weren't fantasy. They were testimony. She went out to the balcony and looked at the wilting tomato plant. She touched one of its brittle leaves, and a fine, gray powder came off on her fingers. She looked from her hand to the smokestacks in the distance. The fight wasn't just in the doctor's office anymore. It was here. It was in the air. It was in the dust on her son's windowsill, and she was the only one willing to see it. The nights became her laboratory. After her shift at the diner, after Samuel was asleep, his breathing a fragile whistle in the quiet dark, Lena would sit at their small kitchen table. The library became her sanctuary. She, who had barely finished high school, was now poring over environmental science textbooks, learning words like particulate matter and volatile organic compounds. She started a new journal, not for her thoughts, but for her observations. She created a log meticulous and stark. 9:14 p.m., a plume of yellow smoke from stack 3. A smell like burnt plastic. 3:22 a.m., Samuel wakes up wheezing. 1002 p.m., a thick, gray cloud hangs low over the neighborhood, a bitter taste in the air. 4:51 a.m., another emergency room visit. She bought a cheap, second-hand camera and began to document the sky from her balcony, capturing the unnatural colors of the plant's nightly exhalations. The pictures were grainy, imperfect, but they were proof. They were her truth, captured on film. She tried to talk to her neighbors. Mrs. Henderson in 2B, whose husband had worked at Viridian for 30 years, just shook her head. "That plant puts food on our tables, Lena. Best not to stir the pot." Mr. Jean, who sat on the front stoop all day, his own cough a dry, rattling thing, just laughed. "That's the smell of money, girl. Been that way since I was a boy." Some listened. They nodded. They spoke of their own children's coughs, the headaches, the strange rashes, but they were afraid. They had jobs to protect, families to feed. To fight Viridian was to fight the hand that fed the entire East Side, even if that hand was slowly, methodically killing them. Lena felt a profound and chilling isolation. She was a woman with a shoebox full of medical bills, a sketchbook of gray skies, and a journal of observations that everyone told her meant nothing. She was a Cassandra in a fourth-floor apartment, screaming a warning that no one wanted to hear. Her breaking point came in the form of a crisp, formal letter, a notice from Samuel's school. His absences were becoming a problem. If his attendance didn't improve, he would have to repeat the 3rd grade. The paper trembled in her hand. They weren't just stealing his breath, they were stealing his future. The city council chamber was designed to feel important, with its dark wood paneling and rows of cushioned seats. It was also designed to make people like Lena feel small. She stood at the public lectern, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Her journal and a stack of her grainy photographs lay on the wood in front of her. At a long, polished table sat the council members, their faces impassive. And at the center of them all sat Wallace Thorne, Viridian's head of community relations. He was handsome in a corporate, bloodless way, with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Lena's voice shook as she began to speak. She talked about the smell, the dust, the color of the smoke. She talked about her son. She held up one of his drawings, the one of the sky raining gray specks. "My son can't breathe," she said, her voice cracking. "And this is why." Thorne listened with a look of practiced sympathy. When she was finished, he stood up, his movements fluid and confident. He walked to the lectern beside hers, not looking at her but at the council, at the small crowd. "Thank you, Miss Adebayo," he began, his voice smooth as silk. "Your passion is truly commendable." He let the word passion hang in the air, a polite dismissal, a pat on the head for the hysterical little woman. "At Viridian," he continued, turning to a large screen behind him, "safety is our #1 priority." A slick PowerPoint presentation appeared. Charts, graphs, statistics. Words like compliance, regulatory standards, and award-winning protocols filled the screen. He addressed her journal with a wave of his hand. "While anecdotal evidence can be very powerful emotionally, it is not, unfortunately, science." He smiled his empty smile. "The dust you mentioned is likely pollen. The smells, a combination of traffic from the interstate and other urban odors." He didn't even glance at her photos. He didn't have to. He had already dismissed them and her completely. The council members nodded, their faces reflecting the serene certainty of his presentation. The hearing was over. Lena packed her journal and photos back into her tote bag, her hands clumsy with humiliation. The sound of Thorne laughing with one of the councilmen followed her out of the chamber. She walked into the cool night air, the familiar chemical tang greeting her like a slap. She had brought her pain to the seat of power, and they had thanked her for it, then thrown it in the trash. It was a new kind of violation, a public stripping of her credibility that left her feeling more raw and alone than ever before. She stood on the steps of City Hall, and for the first time she truly understood. This wasn't a fight she could win with passion. They wanted science. They wanted proof. "Fine," she thought, the anger a hot, clean flame in her chest. "I'll give them proof." Just as the last sliver of hope was about to extinguish, a voice cut through her despair. "Miss Adebayo." A young woman stood at the bottom of the City Hall steps. She had been in the back of the chamber, typing furiously on a laptop. She introduced herself as Maya, a freelance journalist who covered local environmental stories. "I believe you," Maya said, her voice quiet but firm. "Everything you said. I've heard whispers of it for years, but no one's ever been willing to go on the record." Maya wasn't polished like the reporters from the downtown news stations. She was hungry, and she had a righteous spark in her eyes that reminded Lena of her own. For the first time in months, Lena didn't feel completely alone. Maya had a contact. A man named Dr. Ben Carter, a former EPA scientist who had been pushed into early retirement after he tried to blow the whistle on a corporation just like Viridian. He was brilliant, bitter, and living in a small town 2 hours away. He was, Maya said, their only shot. The meeting took place in Carter's cluttered study, a room that smelled of old books and brewing coffee. He was a bear of a man with a wild gray beard and eyes that had seen too much. He listened to Lena's story without interruption, flipping through her journal, studying Samuel's drawings with a startling intensity. He held one of her blurry night photos up to the light. He didn't dismiss her. He didn't call her passionate. He looked at her with the weary respect of a fellow soldier. "They're venting at night," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Releasing the worst of it when the monitors are less likely to catch a spike. It's a classic move." He explained the science to her in a way no one else had, breaking down the chemical compounds, the way they traveled on the wind, the way they settled in the soil and in the lungs of a child. He told them what they needed, not just pictures, but samples, soil from her garden, water from the creek that ran behind their neighborhood, dust from her windowsill. But the testing is expensive, Carter warned. And Viridian owns every lab in a 100-mile radius. You need an independent analysis. Maya found a small environmental action group that offered community grants. They wrote a proposal, late into the night at Lena's kitchen table, fueled by coffee and a shared, desperate hope. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The work was slow, methodical, and clandestine. Lena, armed with sterile jars and careful instructions from Carter, collected the samples under the cover of darkness. She felt like a spy in her own life, scooping soil from her blighted garden while the orange glow of the plant pulsed on the horizon. Maya documented everything, her camera no longer just for journalism but for evidence. They overnighted the samples to an independent lab in another state, the shipping cost taking nearly all of Lena's savings. The waiting was the hardest part. Every cough from Samuel's room sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. The doubt crept back in. What if Thorne was right? What if it was just pollen? What if she was just a hysterical mother chasing ghosts? During those weeks, Ben Carter became their anchor. He'd call and walk them through Viridian's own publicly available emissions reports, pointing out the loopholes, the doctored numbers, the statistical magic tricks they used to hide the truth. "They're lying," he'd grumble over the phone. "They're just so good at it that nobody ever bothers to check the math." He was teaching them to speak the language of their enemy. One Tuesday afternoon, the email arrived. The subject line was simple: "Lab results attached." Lena's hands trembled as she opened the file. Maya leaned over her shoulder, both of them holding their breath. It was a dense document, a string of chemical names and numbers that meant little to them at first. Lena immediately forwarded it to Carter. An hour later, he called back. His voice was grim. "You got them, Lena," he said. "It's all here. Arsenic lead benzene, at levels that aren't just illegal, they're criminal. The soil in your garden is toxic. The dust on your windowsill, my God, this isn't just pollution, it's an assault." Lena closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the exhaustion on her face. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of vindication. She finally had her proof. Cold, hard, and irrefutable. The second town hall was for Viridian's proposed expansion. The chamber was even more crowded this time. Wallace Thorne was on stage, basking in the glow of the projector screen, his smile wider, his confidence absolute. He was painting a future of jobs, prosperity, and community partnership. Dr. Finch was in the audience, invited as a guest to speak on the community's general health, a subtle endorsement of the plant's benign presence. Lena waited in the back with Maya. She wore a simple, dignified dress she'd bought from a thrift store. She held no journal, no grainy photos. She held only a quiet, unshakable certainty. As Thorne prepared to take his final questions, Lena walked down the central aisle. A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne's smile tightened for a fraction of a second when he saw her. "Miss Adebayo," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Back for another passionate appeal." Lena reached the lectern. She didn't look at him. She looked at the city council, at the faces in the crowd, at the reporters Maya had tipped off. "No, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone. "It didn't shake. Not this time. I'm here to present the science." She nodded to Maya, who clicked a key on her laptop. The Viridian logo on the screen behind Thorne vanished. It was replaced by the lab report. The words arsenic, lead, and benzene appeared in bold, red letters next to numbers that were stark and damning. A gasp rippled through the room. Thorne's face went slack, the color draining from it. This is doctored evidence," he stammered, scrambling for control. "This is from an independent, EPA-certified laboratory," Lena said, her voice cutting through his panic. "It's a sample of the soil from my garden, the garden where I try to grow food for my son." Another click from Maya's laptop. A new slide appeared. A map of the neighborhood, with red dots marking houses where children had been diagnosed with severe respiratory conditions in the last 5 years. Her own building was at the epicenter. "You called my observations anecdotal," Lena continued, her gaze finally landing on Thorne. "So I gathered data." Dr. Finch in the audience was trying to become invisible, sinking lower in his seat, but Lena saw him. "And Dr. Finch," she said, her voice ringing out, "you told me my son's illness was due to his lifestyle." The camera of a local news crew swiveled to find the doctor's face. He looked like a man caught in a spotlight, naked and exposed. "You told me to clean my house, but the poison isn't in my house. It's in the air you and this council have allowed Viridian to pump into our lungs every single night." The screen changed again. This time it was Ben Carter's face, live via video call, his gray beard a symbol of righteous authority. He proceeded to systematically dismantle Viridian's own safety reports, pointing out the falsified data, the statistical lies, the cover-up buried in plain sight. And then, the final, devastating blow. Maya hit play on an audio file. A man's voice, digitally altered but clear, filled the chamber. It was a former Viridian shift manager. He spoke of the midnight vents, the illegal, unreported releases of raw chemical waste. "We were told to do it between 2 and 4 a.m., the voice confessed. "Management called it letting off steam. They said no one would ever know." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a truth so undeniable it crushed every lie that had come before it. Wallace Thorne stood frozen on the stage, his perfect smile gone, his face a mask of ruin. The council members stared, horrified. They weren't just complicit, they were caught. Lena stood at the lectern, her quiet strength filling the entire room. She had not raised her voice. She had not wept. She had simply brought the facts, and the facts had brought them all to their knees. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The expansion was denied unanimously. Federal EPA agents, armed with the evidence Lena had provided, swarmed the Viridian plant the next day, launching a full-scale criminal investigation. Wallace Thorne was fired, his corporate ascent ending in a spectacular public disgrace. Dr. Finch's medical license was suspended pending a board review for gross negligence. The city council faced a firestorm of public outrage and recall petitions. But Lena's victory wasn't celebrated with parades or press conferences. It was quiet. It was personal. It was in the air itself. Months later, she stood on her small balcony. The metallic tang was gone, replaced by the clean, earthy smell of rain-washed pavement. In the pot where the tomato vine had withered, a new one was thriving, its leaves a vibrant, healthy green. Below, in the small patch of grass behind the building, Samuel was playing. He was running, chasing a soccer ball with two other boys from the building. He stopped, panting, his face flushed with the exertion of a normal, healthy child. He wasn't wheezing. He didn't reach for his inhaler. He just laughed, his breath coming easy and deep. He looked up at her, shielding his eyes from the sun, and held up a new drawing. On the paper, a bright, friendly sun smiled down from a sky of perfect, impossible blue. Lena looked from the drawing to the real sky, which for the first time in years seemed to match. She watched her son take another deep, clean breath, and she knew her fight hadn't just been about proving them wrong. It was about giving him back his sky. They had tried to suffocate his future. But a mother's love is the one thing in this world that never runs out of air.